I was 20 years old when my best friend and I rented a small house on the edge of the Pennsylvania woods. We were both broke college kids, desperate for a cheap place to live, and this old property seemed perfect. It was secluded, quiet, and surrounded by tall trees that blocked out most of the world. The landlord told us it had been empty for years, but he didn't say why. We didn't ask. We just wanted a roof over our heads. The first night should have been peaceful. The only sounds were the crickets outside and the occasional owl. But sometime after midnight, I heard footsteps. Slow, deliberate steps creaked across the kitchen floor. At first, I assumed it was my friend, maybe getting a late-night snack. "Hey, Mark." I called out from my room. No answer. The footsteps stopped. I got up, grabbed my phone for light, and walked into the kitchen. It was dark and colder than the rest of the house, a strange chill that made my breath visible. But the room was empty. The back door was shut, the windows locked. I told myself it was just the old house settling and went back to bed. The next night, it happened again, but this time it was louder. I heard the door to the back porch slowly open with a groan, then slam shut. I jumped out of bed and ran straight to the door. To my shock, the deadbolt was still locked from the inside, the chain latch in place. Nobody could have come in or out. My friend swore he hadn't left his room. By the third night, I was already on edge. I barely slept, waiting for sounds to start again. Around 2 a.m., I heard not footsteps this time, but whispering, a low, indistinct murmur, as if two people were talking in hushed tones just outside my bedroom. I pressed my ear to the wall, heart racing. The voices moved, drifting toward the hallway. I forced myself to open the door, only to be met by silence and darkness. The whispers had stopped. That morning, I noticed something that chilled me more than anything else. In the thin layer of dust near the back door, there were footprints, bare human footprints. They weren't ours. We had been wearing socks or shoes the entire time. These prints looked small, almost childlike, but the toes were unusually long, curling slightly at the ends. I wanted to leave right then, but Mark insisted we were imagining things. He said old houses creak, wind makes strange noises, and dust can shift. I wanted to believe him, until the fourth night. At around 3 a.m., I woke to the sound of the bedroom door handle turning. Slowly, deliberately, my stomach dropped. I froze in bed, holding my breath, watching the knob twist back and forth. Then it stopped. For a moment, everything was silent. Suddenly, the door creaked open an inch, and I saw a hand, pale, thin fingers with nails that looked too sharp, too long. I screamed and leapt out of bed, slamming the door shut and locking it. Mark came running, banging on the door from the hallway. He swore he hadn't touched it, that he'd been asleep until I screamed. We spent the rest of the night sitting together in the living room, all the lights on, weapons in hand. Nothing happened, but when the sun rose, we checked the house. In the kitchen, the back door stood wide open. The deadbolt was still in place. The chain latch was still locked, yet the door was open. That was the last straw. We packed up and left that morning, not even bothering to tell the landlord. A few weeks later, out of morbid curiosity, I searched online for stories about that property. I found a newspaper article from the 1980s. A family had lived there once, a couple and their young daughter. One night, the parents were found murdered in their bed. Their throats had been slit. The daughter was never found. Some said she ran away into the woods. Others whispered she was still there, lurking in the house, waiting for company. I don't know what we saw or what almost opened my door that night. But sometimes when I think back to those long, pale fingers curling around the wood, I can't help but wonder if the little girl ever really left. I've worked as a nurse for nearly 10 years, and I've seen more than enough to make most people uneasy. Death is part of the job. You grow used to it. The stillness of a body, the quiet that fills a room after a last breath. But there's one night from my early career that has never left me. A night shift that convinced me some patients don't always move on. I had just started working the graveyard shift at a mid-sized hospital in Ohio. The hours were long, the halls dimly lit, and most nights were eerily quiet. The staff joked about the witching hour, 3 a.m., when call lights would flash on by themselves and machines would beep for no apparent reason. I laughed along at first, but deep down I felt uneasy. One particular night, I was assigned to the older wing of the hospital, which was nearly empty except for a handful of patients. Most were asleep. The only sounds were the steady hum of the fluorescent lights and the occasional squeak of my shoes on the tile floor. Around 2:45 a.m., I passed by room 12. It was supposed to be empty. The patient had died earlier that day, and housekeeping hadn't yet come to prepare the room. Out of habit, I glanced in as I walked by, and that's when I saw someone sitting on the bed. It was a man, maybe in his 70s. His shoulders were hunched, and he stared at the floor, hands clasped together as if in prayer. He wore a hospital gown, the same kind we gave to all our patients. My first thought was that housekeeping must have mistakenly moved someone into a room early. I stepped inside. "Sir, are you okay?" I asked gently. The man didn't look up. His hands trembled. His breathing was shallow and raspy, like he was struggling. I hurried closer, already reaching for the call button to get a doctor. That's when I froze. The bed was perfectly made beneath him. Tight sheets, smooth blanket, untouched pillow. He wasn't sitting on the bed. He was hovering just above it. My heart slammed in my chest. I stumbled back, nearly dropping the call button. When I blinked, the man was gone. The room was empty again, the bed still made, the air heavy with the faint smell of antiseptic. I ran to the nurse's station and told my supervisor. She gave me a knowing look, like she'd heard it all before. "Room 12, she asked. I nodded. She sighed. "Don't worry, you're not the first." She explained that years ago, a man had died in that very room during the night shift. He had begged the nurses to stay with him, terrified of dying alone, but the staff were overwhelmed that night and couldn't be by his side when he passed. Ever since, nurses reported seeing him, sitting on the bed, waiting. I wanted to believe it was stress or exhaustion, some trick of the mind, but the rest of that shift only made things worse. At exactly 3:07 a.m., the monitors at the nurse's station flickered. The screen for room 12, though it wasn't connected to any patient, lit up with a flat line. A long, piercing beep filled the air. We scrambled to shut it off, but the machine wouldn't respond. Finally, one of the older nurses unplugged the entire unit. Only then did the sound stop. For the rest of the night, I avoided that hallway. But just before dawn, I had to pass by room 12 again. My stomach twisted with dread as I approached the door. The room was silent, empty, but on the bed, the perfectly smooth sheets now had an impression, like the shape of a body lying there. I quit that wing a few months later, transferring to pediatrics. But every now and then, when I'm alone in a quiet hospital room late at night, I remember that man, his trembling hands, his desperate breathing, the way he looked like he was waiting for someone who never came. And sometimes when a patient passes in the night, I catch myself whispering, "You're not alone," because I never want to see another ghost sitting on a freshly made bed, still waiting. It was the summer of 2014, and I had just finished a long shift at work. I lived in a rural part of Montana, where the road stretched on for miles with nothing but fields and forest on either side. My drive home usually took about 40 minutes, and I enjoyed the quiet. The stars out there were brighter than anywhere else I'd ever seen. That night, I left the office around midnight. The air was cool, and a thin mist clung to the asphalt. I rolled down the window, turned up the radio, and settled in for the drive. The road was empty, no headlights behind me, no taillights ahead, just me and the dark. About 20 minutes in, I saw something up ahead. At first, I thought it was a deer crossing the road, so I slowed down, but as my headlights swept across the figure, I realized it wasn't an animal. It was a man. He stood on the shoulder, facing the trees, completely still. He wore a faded plaid shirt and jeans. His hair was wild, like he hadn't cut it in years, and his hands hung limply at his sides. I slowed to a crawl, half expecting him to weigh me down for help, but he didn't move. Didn't even turn to look at me, just stared into the woods, as if something was waiting for him there. I felt uneasy, but I told myself maybe he'd been hiking and gotten lost. Against my better judgment, I pulled over and rolled the passenger window down. "Hey, are you all right? Do you need a ride into town?" The man didn't answer. Slowly, he turned his head toward me. I wish he hadn't. His face was pale, too pale, like paper left out in the sun. His eyes, they weren't right. The pupils were huge, swallowing almost all the color, and they didn't reflect the light from my headlights. He stared at me with that empty gaze, his mouth twitching at the corners as if trying to form words. Every instinct screamed at me to drive away. I reached for the gear shift, ready to pull out, when suddenly he moved, not toward the car, but toward the woods. Without a sound, he walked straight into the trees and vanished into the darkness. I sat there for a long moment, my heart pounding, the silence pressing in around me. Finally, I hit the gas and drove off, faster than before. 10 minutes later, I glanced in the rear-view mirror. My stomach dropped. Someone was sitting in the back seat. I swerved so hard I nearly drove off the road. When I looked again, the seat was empty. I told myself it was my imagination, a trick of the shadows. But the smell, God, the smell still lingered, damp earth, like wet soil clinging to skin. I drove the rest of the way home with every light on in the car, refusing to look in the mirror again. When I pulled into my driveway, I practically sprinted to the door, fumbling with my keys. Inside, I locked every window, every door, but the unease didn't fade. Out of paranoia, I went to check the back seat once more, just to reassure myself. There on the fabric was a wet smear of mud. I didn't sleep that night, and in the weeks that followed, I kept seeing him. Not always clearly. Sometimes just a shadow at the tree line when I left for work. Sometimes a figure standing under a streetlight as I drove home. Always watching, never speaking. The worst was a night I woke at 3 a.m. to the sound of my front door creaking open. I grabbed a baseball bat and crept down the hall, my pulse hammering. The door was shut and locked tight, but across the hardwood floor, leading from the door to the living room, were muddy footprints. They stopped in the middle of the room. No exit, no return, just stopped. I never saw him again after that summer. I eventually moved across the state, trying to put behind me. But sometimes, when I'm driving late at night on an empty road, I still feel that same chill. And I can't help but check the back seat, because some rides, once offered, never really end.